Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Every episode, we sit down to chat about the book read most recently by one of our book clubs. What did we make of them? Did they spark debate? And whether we loved them or loathed them, the big question is always, were they great book club books?
Today we're talking about All Passion Spent by Vita Sackville-West, which I read with my book club recently. It was recommended to us by Emily Rhodes, whose walking book club on Hampstead Heath featured on episode 5. It's one of her all-time favourite reads, and so of course we had to give it a try. But what did my book club make of it?
And for our regular book club interview, we discussed all things books and knitting with Maeve O'Sullivan.
We're known as the Kniterati. Laura stated that Canadians don't like a pun, but I would like to refute that statement. What unites us is our love of knitting and our love of books.
And we round all that off with some recommendations for your next book club read, inspired by All Passion Spent. Hi Laura.
Hi Kate.
What did Maeve mean that Canadians can't pun?
That was me trying to justify my own inability to pun and indeed recognise puns.
It's just a personal failing.
It's just a personal failing.
And so here we are in the shed in the pitch black of my garden, and it feels like very much now hunkering down.
Well, except that it's warm again.
Well,
Yes, yesterday it was chilly.
I think it's more the light.
I've been overheating everywhere.
And I was thinking, this is great. This is a time for really digging into some serious winter reading. But then at the same time, I find I'm very seduced by the winter box set. The lure of...
Yeah. There's a lot of good stuff out there right now. I really want to watch Alias Grace, which is on Netflix now and is the only Margaret Atwood book I like. It's supposed to be good. Anyway, All Passion Spent. I was really excited about this book, and I knew that Emily had recommended it. I remember that from episode 5. Were your book club happy to follow her recommendation?
I think so. I think we were all in the mood for a change. We just finished The Snow Leopard, Peter Matheson, and this felt like it was going to be a very different sort of read. But it is a shame that you weren't there, because there was a brief flirtation with the idea of doing a fantasy novel.
I should have been there. I could have given you some good ones.
Yeah, because that was the problem. No one actually had a really good, solid suggestion, and the one suggestion that we had was sort of dismissed by the majority of the book club, and so we settled on this, which,
something very different,
which came highly recommended, and I think ultimately was a very worthy choice. So what's it about? After the death of Lord Slane, a former Prime Minister of Great Britain and Viceroy of India, everyone assumes that his 88-year-old widow will slowly fade away in her grief, remaining as proper, decorative and dutiful as she had been her entire life. The deceptively gentle Lady Slane has other ideas. First, she defies the patronising meddling of her children and escapes to a rented house in Hampstead, and there, to her offspring's utter amazement, she revels in her new freedom, recalls her youthful ambitions, and gathers some very unsuitable companions who reveal to her just how much she had sacrificed under the pressure of others' expectations.
That's a very good synopsis. You wrote that yourself.
Yeah, with a little help from Penguin.
It sounds great. And I remember Emily talking about this book and thinking, oh, that sounds like such a cozy read. I can't wait to settle into that. What did your book club make of it?
I think the first thing that strikes you when you start reading this book is that it's actually not cozy. It's quite sort of spiky and pointed and very precise and crisp. And I think you come to Vita Sackville-West with a certain set of expectations. It's a subject that many people are familiar with. I certainly had read quite a few things about Vita Sackville-West.
I haven't read anything about her, but I do know her connection to the Bloomsbury Group.
Well, I think usually that's sort of the way in, is you get interested in Virginia Woolf. You read everything there is to know about Virginia Woolf, and then you're like, Vita Sackville-West, she's so intriguing, and you start to read about her. And also she was, in her own right, just this absolutely fascinating individual. So I had read about her life, but I'd never read anything that she had written. And I think for all of the book club, not just me, this just felt like such a revelation, because it's such beautiful, as I said, there's a sort of crispness and a precision to it that's a real delight and very unexpected, and she's clever, and you really sense that. And so again, it's that pleasing sense of the author's intelligence, and you sort of know you're in safe hands. It feels very assured, in fact.
That's very interesting.
What was your reaction? I just forgot. We hadn't discussed this. You don't necessarily agree with me. What did you make of it?
I had wondered why someone with such a fabulous name as Vita Sackville-West, who was a part of the Bloomsbury group, who, you know, had a romantic relationship with Virginia Woolf, wasn't that well known to me. And then I read this book and I thought, oh, it's not nearly half as good as Virginia Woolf. And I didn't like much about it, to be honest.
That's so interesting, because one of the things that came up in book club was the degree to which is a kind of crossover with the work of Virginia Woolf. And I particularly felt there's 3 sections to this book. There's a sort of opening. The first third is about the death of her husband and how she chooses to arrange her life. And it's this act of self-determination that's the thing that takes her quite elderly children, because they're all in their late 60s with grandchildren of their own, and Lady Slane is in her late 80s, and she informs them that she won't be doing what it is that they have planned for her, which is some kind
sharing
of
her
timeshare arrangement. That's right, where she'll go and live at each of their houses and pay them for her board. She's going to take herself off and live in this house in Hampstead that she's going to find all by herself, and she doesn't want any help, and they're just to leave her to it. So the first part is sort of setting up this situation and this character, and then off she goes to find her Hampstead house. And then there's a wonderful middle section which takes place on the train as she travels to Hampstead, and this very elderly lady is travelling. She's quite frail. She travels at quite a slow pace, and that journey, it's her
reflections.
Exactly, very much as you do, as people tend to do when you're sitting on a train and you're sort of staring out of the window, or you know, you're sort of in motion somehow.
And it's punctuated by the tube stops, so her mind is wandering.
But it's very much this sort of stream of consciousness that I really associate with the writing of Virginia Woolf. And actually, I thought this was so perfectly done. It was so precise. It was so pleasing. And that made me sit up that middle section. And then the third section is her establishing herself in her house, and then the life that she leads there, and the sort of eccentric old gentlemen who become her friends. And that's a sort of another section again. But it was really that middle section that pleased me so much. I felt, you know, she was a real talent in her own right, and that her writing was easily on a par with Woolf's.
I don't know, it felt very shallow to me. The writing feels like it's executed very well. You could read any little bit separately and think, oh, this is quite beautiful writing. But it didn't hang together. The characters never came to life for me. And in fact, Lady Slane was just a bit of a wet lettuce. I struggled.
Well, she's very elegant, sort of beautifully draped.
Oh, she's just...
Because the whole book is really about her inner life, and the fact that her entire life she subjugated her own wishes and desires to those of her husband. And I think what's very interesting about that is that we know that in real life Vita Sackville-West very much did not do this. She had a very interesting relationship with her husband Harold Nicholson, where they both continued to have affairs with people. They effectively had, it seems, an open marriage. And she did travel with him. There are many parallels, in fact. Lady Slane went out to India and was at her husband's side as he sort of managed the empire. Vita Sackville-West travelled with Harold out to Egypt, to Persia, I think, and was based in the embassy out there as part of his diplomatic work. But she didn't enjoy it. And actually, she made a point that she wanted to come home, and that's what ended up happening. And she came back to England, and she sort of pursued her own writing and her own interests back at home. But so she did make that decision and assert herself, and she wasn't prepared to sacrifice her own independence and her own artistic ambition towards the life of her husband.
My problem was I just didn't actually believe that Lady Slane was in any way an artist.
It's an odd situation because she never even attempts to put a brush to canvas.
Ever. Even before she gets married.
Well, I think it's made quite clear in the book that before she gets married, she doesn't really have an opportunity. Her existence is very circumscribed by the expectations of her family. She doesn't have any money of her own. She doesn't have any independence. And so even the question of marriage, she's not really ever asked. She just sort of gracefully accedes to what's expected of her with just this small worm of, but I wanted to do something else, and yet she doesn't have the courage to actually speak out and basically make a stand.
But what did your book club make of that? Because it's all well and good to think that your ambitions were thwarted, but she doesn't take any responsibility at all. Like, painting is a very domestic activity.
Yeah, I don't know. Somehow in the book it is very clear that once she was set on this path, it seemed there was no option for her to kind of
But why,
have any form of self-expression.
I am someone who likes to sort things out and get things done. And of course, so there's a bit of personal impatience with Lady Slane.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that we know that in fact this wasn't Vita's own experience of life, and that she wrote this book 2 years after Virginia Woolf wrote her very famous feminist essay, A Room of One's Own, in which she argued that women need and have a right to have a personal space that's outside of the domestic sphere, and that they must have this in order to be able to work. So we know that Vita considered these things and was aware of them. In the book club, we talked about the way that this artistic impulse is somehow isolated. It's almost like because it's something that's been repressed. And we also remarked on the fact that she never actually even tries to paint anything. But that was kind of nice. It's not about executing something, it's about the idea. And I feel like this idea of freedom and personal expression, that somehow through the idea of a creative force, she was able to kind of take that idea in a very pure form. That's what's sort of woven through this novel, and I think that's the thing. We commented on how there are so many elements of this that are just timeless, and that felt very true. It's as true now as it was back then, as it has been throughout human history.
Timeless. For me, it felt so dated, and the characters are such caricatures of well-off, indulged, wealthy British aristocrats. Like, Lady Slade isn't that sympathetic. Everyone seems to be quite taken with her, especially, the friends that she builds up around her in Hampstead. At the same time, she has this French maid, Janou, who's been with her since, I think, Lady Slane got married, I think, when she was 17 or 18, and she's had Janou with her
since the India days,
for 70
her entire life.
Her entire life, and it's in the final closing pages that she learns a little bit about Janou's family and her upbringing, and she thinks, oh gosh, aren't I selfish? That I've never even asked Janou about her life before, and I'm like, well, yes, you are.
I think that is a fair point, and I think we also discussed the idea that, in a way, although we all felt there were certain timeless qualities, and we can come back to that in a second, but equally it does speak of a certain aristocratic world of entitlement and privilege that Vita was certainly a part of. In some ways, it felt like she hadn't really in any way been able to transcend that, and it was very much of its time, and it was written by a person who was very much from a certain background and a certain class. And yet, the fact that that's in there, that little nugget, why did she put that in there? I mean, what point was she trying to make? Was that the point that she was trying to make, that sometimes we can be so preoccupied with our own lives and our own desires that we're blind to the stories of others? And I think Lady Slane has that little tiny moment of insight, but obviously as a reader, we're expected to have a lot more.
I think it's more hackneyed than that, because actually I think Vita Sackville-West was setting up this idea that blood and family stitches your life together. Janou's story precedes Lady Slane's connection with her great-granddaughter that comes at the very end. And there's other moments like that, early on there's a memory of Fitzgeorge, who is this eccentric millionaire who's friends with her son. And actually, when he hears that Lord Slane has died, he thinks, I'm going to pay Lady Slane a visit. And Lady Slane doesn't remember him, but Fitzgeorge had met her in India when her husband was Viceroy and had travelled with them, and they'd had this moment. And that moment is mentioned earlier in the book in passing, even though Lady Slane has to kind of be reminded before it comes back to her that this was, in fact, Fitzgeorge.
Yeah, the whole Fitzgeorge relationship, this strange old, all the characters in this book are old, but it's like,
which I like,
old and older.
I like so much about the idea of this book. I love focusing on an older woman and the life she lives right at the last moments where she thinks that there is no more life for her.
To me, although I didn't really recognise the characters in this book, I thought they were beautifully drawn in quite a sort of spare way. The husband, even at the very beginning when he dies, whereas we haven't read anything.
We haven't read an extract.
No, and that was actually the extract perhaps we should do the reading and then talk about the tone, but it's very funny in quite a sort of dry way, but nonetheless there is this persistent sense of humour and not taking any of it too seriously that I really enjoyed. So yes, 90, how old was he? 94?
Mm-hmm.
94-year-old.
He was 6 or 7 years older.
That's right. Henry Holland, Lord Slane, has died finally, to the great surprise of everybody, because he was just such a familiar figure. Yet, for all its dignity, death brought a revelation. The face which had been so noble in life lost a trifle of its nobility in death. The carefully concealed ambition now revealed itself fully in the proud curve of the nostril. The hardness, which had disguised itself under the charming manner, now remained alone, robbed of the protection of a smile. He was beautiful, but he was less agreeable. Alone in the room, his widow contemplated him, filled with thoughts that would greatly have surprised her children, could they have but read her mind. But so this man who we never actually get to know in any way, he dies at the beginning of the book, nonetheless was as vivid to me as if I could sort of see him lying there. And she constantly does that. She's able to sort of sketch out her characters and in a way that, to me, it felt very original. I was often surprised by her sentences.
What about the children? Surely you didn't think they were original.
Well, there's not much to them, really, is
They're
there?
monsters.
Yeah. Well,
and she's their mother.
I didn't actually think they were that monstrous. I just thought they were all very sort of prosaic. And in the context of this book, that's where their monstrousness comes from. They are obsessed with propriety and also money. They're all quite greedy.
Yeah.
But, none of them really say anything that terrible. I think the two supposedly nicest ones, the ones perhaps that are the most sympathetic, are Edith, who is the sort of old maid who's been living with her parents and looking after them, and really just wants to be left alone to live by herself. And I think Vita's sympathies are with her. And the other one, who goes on to play quite an important role, the collector, what was his name?
Kay,
who is gay.
Oh, yes, probably. We don't know that for sure,
do we? I think.
Really?
Yeah. So
I'm oblivious. I don't get puns. I don't notice.
That's his and
subtle sexuality.
And so ends up having, yes, I suppose it's not a physical relationship, but nonetheless a close relationship with
that's not romantic.
You didn't?
No.
I sort of took that as
they're both just weird collectors.
Well, maybe it's funny.
But I think you very well could be right that he was gay, and that's why he never. I don't know. He's just a bit of a hermit.
Well, he
didn't like people.
Someone else, so another character who actually doesn't really ever get to truly express themselves or discover their own inner spark. To know themselves. They're all a bit blind to themselves, and Lady Slane is the one character who actually takes a good look inside herself and realizes that she hasn't wasted her whole life, but she's never done what she wanted. And so takes this step that right now, at the end of her life, she's going to go off and do it. Amanda said, don't we all worry about old age? Don't we all sort of worry deep down that we're just going to end up old and crazed with regret? And,
God.
This idea that...
No.
It's just like a worry, isn't it? It's like, am I living my life as fully as because when I'm old, am I going to look back and think, oh, I wish I'd done this and this and this? And I think that's quite a timeless preoccupation. I think,
God.
Okay.
Maybe I'm just not there yet.
Well, perhaps it's something that happens to you as you get older as well. It becomes more of an issue.
I just don't think it's
You're
my
younger
disposition.
Than me. You haven't got... You're still on the glass half full stage. You haven't got to the glass emptying.
Not that.
And in which sense, to anyone who occasionally struggles with those kinds of thoughts, this is a very reassuring book in a way. It's a warm, funny book that begins with death and ends with death.
Yes.
And yet somehow it manages to be incredibly life-affirming. And I don't think... Yeah, I didn't think it was the most extraordinary work of literature I'd ever read, but I did think it was very worthwhile and a pleasure to read, and I enjoyed it kind of intellectually, and I was amused by it, and I would... Perhaps it's very interesting, actually, this reminds me. So Andy, he said, we're doing our little thing at the end where I get people to go around and give a star rating, and he gave it his. I should just check.
What was his star?
I have to look in my notebook to see what he gave it. So Andy gave it 3 stars. He said, I was surprised. I liked it and I hadn't expected to. I liked the characters and the writing. I was struck by the turning point when Lady Slane first gets engaged. Would I recommend it? No. Am I pleased that I read it? Yes. And he said, but I won't be seeking out anything else by her. And I laughed and I said, so you did enjoy it? And he's like, yes. And I said, you sort of feel you got something out of it? And he said, yes. But I said, but you wouldn't recommend it? He's like, no. I was like, well,
I wouldn't recommend it.
Why wouldn't you want to pass on those feelings to someone else? But I think perhaps that's that slight ambivalence. It's a really interesting book, but maybe it's not something you would rush to recommend.
It's not great literature. It's not Mrs. Dalloway. I mean, Mrs. Dalloway is much more challenging. And Mrs. Dalloway, equally though, is could be just this shallow hostess character. But the themes there and the exploration of life and regret. And also, the dark side of life, because you have a character suffering from post-traumatic stress and contemplating suicide. So it's a much richer novel, a much more experimental novel, much more groundbreaking novel. So this feels quite nice, but it's kind of Virginia Woolf light.
I think in our ongoing preoccupation with what makes a good book club book, it wasn't a bad book club book. There was plenty to discuss. But in a way, I think it was almost one where most people liked it, or they really liked it. One of us gave it 5 stars. A couple of us gave
5 stars?
Yeah, Amanda gave it 4 stars. Natalie gave it 4.5.
That's just crazy talk.
And even Andy, who's
I know, I'm surprised.
Could be a harsh scorer, gave it a very generous 3.
I'm
Sally
surprised.
gave it 3.5. And because I haven't got around to writing it up yet, I haven't actually had to commit to my star.
So maybe I would have been the contrarian.
I think you very much would have. And perhaps that's why we could have done with you there. Because generally, I think there was just, it's interesting, isn't it? It's those kinds of discussions when there's a basic consensus and then it's just almost enjoying fleshing out why you feel the way you do about it, as opposed to those books where they're very divisive and there's a real debate and one group of people are trying to persuade the other group of people or try and get them to think about things differently. And I think this very much fell into the first category.
So we could damn it with light praise and say a pleasant read, but perhaps not a great book club book.
I do think, for me, there was a kind of quality to the prose and a sort of excellence in the writing.
But that does not a good book club make. Good book club book
I agree.
make.
As a work of literature, I was very surprised by it and I was very pleased to have discovered it. And I was very impressed by her as a writer. But it's true, as a book club book, like Andy, we enjoyed it and we all got something from it, but would we recommend it? I'm not sure. Attempting to discuss books while keeping a careful count of your stitches, or perhaps turning the heel of a sock, might not be for everyone. But for a group of dedicated knitters in London's Waterloo, it seems like the most natural thing in the world, and once a month they meet to do just that. And they even have the perfect name.
We're the Kniterati, and what unites us is our love of knitting and our love of books. So that doesn't mean the books we read are about knitting, but what everyone does is bring their projects along with them, and we are a wide range of skills. I consider myself the lower end of the spectrum. I'm usually working on a beanie hat, whereas other people in the group have these wonderful, amazing, very inspirational projects that they work on. I was not a founding member, although by default I've sort of become one of the original members. I joined it the first time, I've joined it twice, as part of a yarn store near Waterloo that had set up the book club. And I joined it about 2010, wanting to meet some people, wanting to build my knitting skills. And I ended up leaving after about 6 months because it was really political. It was a really political book club. It got very difficult to get everyone to agree on what titles we'd read. And it was so big, there were about 17 people. It just felt like not what I was looking for. And I went away and actually came back about 2 years ago, and it was a much smaller group. And funnily enough, there were some founding members there that remembered very distinctly that difficult period of time in the book club's history.
And so what are the mechanics of it? How does it actually work when people come to the book club with their knitting?
We stay quite flexible. There are about 6 of us that are regulars, and we try and keep the book list about 2-3 months ahead. So right now we're already discussing the spring reading list. It's all by consensus, and I think that's where having the slightly smaller group has been really helpful, because we all want diversity and interesting different titles, different authors. We all come from very different backgrounds, and that's something I really like about the book club and why I've stuck with it, because we have an age range of about 20 to 30 years between us. The one thing that really unites us is knitting and books, and so the discussions tend to be quite distinctive and varied and surprising.
And is there something about the, knitting, I think of it has a sort of quite a repetitive, soothing, I think, the soothing element perhaps depends on how competent you are. I find knitting mildly stressful because I have to concentrate so hard. But is there something about that kind of process that actually must go quite well with talking about books?
Very much so. I think when we're having our conversations, you can measure the tempo of the debate and discussion by the knitting that is going on, because there comes a point where we really get into a part of the book, or somebody strongly disagrees with a view about something, and then the knitting gets put down. What I like about knitting is that there is a meditative element to it, the repetition, getting your head around a pattern when it does work. I also, Kate, have been in those difficult moments with a pattern where it's anything but meditative. But I do notice that when things get heated up and when things get contentious, generally the projects get put aside so we can really focus in on what we want to say about the books.
And I wonder if that affects the sorts of books that you're choosing. Is there anything particular, any types of books that you find work well?
The fact that we knit doesn't really impact the type of books that we choose. The only criteria is that it has to be available in a public library. So we actively set out to have a diverse range of topics, of genres, of types of author, of parts of the world, all kinds of things, because I think the one thing we don't want to do is get stuck in a rut.
And is there anything you can think of that's sparked particularly intense debate?
Most of them do. We met this week, and War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, a classic, was what we read. And generally everyone liked it, but there was one member of the group sitting quietly knitting while we were all discussing it. And eventually, someone just said, okay, you've been very quiet over there. And she just said, left me cold. So set us off on a whole other area of conversation about why she didn't like it and why we liked it. And she was fascinated to hear why we liked it. And I've been in that situation myself where I've struggled through a book and been really interested to go just to find out why everyone else actually enjoyed this thing. We've read a few classics this year. Gone with the Wind, which I assumed everyone would love. I read it as a teenager. I reread it with great excitement this summer. And I just assumed we'd all come in just thinking, what a classic, what an amazing novel. But once again, there were two people that just did not like it and one who couldn't even finish it. So that's the joy of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. You mentioned the Kniterati, which makes me think perhaps there are other groups out there. Is it a movement?
Sadly not. So when we moved out of the shop, we realized we need to galvanize. So this has been quite a lovely period for our book club because we've had to really commit to each other. We never did before because the shop was creating the space. So we set up a Facebook group. There is the platform called Ravelry. I call it Facebook for Knitters. It's a wonderful, amazing, geeky space full of free patterns and you can connect with people. And there's a little group there. And we really had to take that over from the store. And Kniterati was the original name of the group from 10 years ago, and we decided to reclaim it. So I would love to see Kniterati springing up elsewhere.
And would you have any recommendations for anyone thinking about trying to set up their own knitting book club?
Starting with a common space is an obvious and easy first start. So I think the longevity of this book club has been based in the fact that there was a fantastic yarn store. I'm really sad that it's no longer going to be there. It's being replaced by a hotel. And I think keeping the diversity certainly has been something that's kept it interesting. We all even have different diverse projects that we're working on.
Yeah, I was wondering actually. So if someone then, while you're together, has a problem, they get sort of stuck on something, is it part book club and part sort of knitting workshop?
Absolutely. So several of my fellow book club members are hugely experienced. And as I say, part of the reason I like going is just to be inspired that I can move beyond my beanies and think bigger about what I could be making. But equally, we help each other out with challenges. We even have a crocheter. That's how diverse we are.
And what are you reading next?
We are reading a really good old thriller. It's called The Dry. And what we're reading in January, part of the reason we chose War of the Worlds right now is the officially endorsed sequel has just been published in paperback. We thought we'd read the original and then follow up in January with the next one. So some good ones coming up.
Is it open to anyone? Could anyone join?
Yes, the book club is open to absolutely anyone. I pitched up myself 2 years ago as a newbie. We are a friendly group, and we always make sure wherever we meet has a glass of wine involved, and it's near Waterloo Station in London.
That sounds great. Maeve, thank you so much for talking to me about your book club. It's hard for me to think of any critical comments to make about that interview because I just love everything about it so much. I love the idea of knitting, I love the idea of reading, and I love the idea of talking about books. There's nothing about it that doesn't delight me.
And that's why I had to let you interview Maeve.
Made me so happy.
You'd been nagging me for a few months. I think as I told Maeve, I was like, Kate keeps saying, when are we going to interview the knitting lady? The knitting lady. So I was very happy to indulge you, and I'm glad that worked.
They must all be quite good though, because I find I enjoy knitting, but I don't do it very often, and the reason I don't do it very often is because I can't really do anything else. I have to just really concentrate on it.
I loved that moment in the interview when Maeve says, and then the discussion gets a bit heated and the needles get put down. It's also quite funny, though, that as a knitting book club, it was quite political in its past.
Well, it's interesting as well because it's a group of people who don't necessarily know each other. You know, my book club is made up of friends and acquaintances. Yours is too. So there's sort of personal connections there. But this seemed like a group of people who just came together because of this wool shop that, you know, they all frequented.
Book clubs do need to be carefully curated, I think. I love having new members, I mean, within a certain size, because I want to make sure that we can always go to the exact same wine bar in central London, and because they have these nooks that we sit in and we have to be able to fit in there. So there's a size question. But I do love having new people come and kind of, you know, turnover. But that said, you kind of have to manage personalities.
Yeah.
We should plug their Facebook page because, you know, membership is open.
Yeah, and that is the best way to find out about them. If you just look them up on Facebook under Kniterati. My only regret is that they don't post more pictures of their projects. It's all quite book-based, and I just wanted more knitting.
Me too? I'm not so crafty.
Inspired by All Passion Spent, here are some more recommendations you might like to try for your next book club read.
I want to recommend Diary of a Provincial Lady by E.M. Delafield. I adore this book, and I wanted to recommend it because I was saying how unsympathetic Lady Slane was to me because she was so privileged and, I don't know, kind of reserved and in her own world. And actually, the narrator of Diary of a Provincial Lady could be accused of all those things as well. She's writing, you know, from her home on a grand estate. I think her husband is the manager of the estate, and she's preoccupied with, you know, disputes with her cook and whether her bulbs are going to come up or not.
I love the thing about the bulbs.
And I
have the same thing every year. I try and plant tulips in the garden, and it's this thing about there's this tiny window of opportunity where you can do it, and if you don't manage to do it in time, then it's too late. And she has the same issue with these hyacinth bulbs up in her attic.
And this was written, you know, back, I think, in the 1930s as well. And yet, somehow, this narrator, you feel like she's your best friend and you know her and you recognise yourself in her. But I think
it's a good parallel because going back to this idea of timelessness, you know, perhaps qualities that you didn't see in All Passion Spent.
That is why I'm recommending this one.
Any woman reading Diary of a Provincial Lady will laugh in recognition because it's
so funny, it's so smart, the writing is really crisp, and I think when you need a book club book that is just a bit of a refresh to set yourself at ease, this is the one for you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it is great. I think it would be a highly enjoyable book club read. Maybe a great one for Christmas, actually, when you don't necessarily want something terribly serious.
Yeah.
This could be a lot of fun.
It's wonderful. And you can buy a beautiful edition from Persephone Books.
Who we must interview. It would be nice as well because it covers the course of a year. So it starts in the depths of winter with these damn bulbs that she's trying to plant in the attic. And then it goes through the whole year and it ends the following Christmas. So yeah, it might be a very nice one for this.
I think I'm going to reread it.
Yeah,
actually,
making me want to reread it. And you don't actually. I don't know if you knew, but there are others. She actually wrote. I think she wrote like 5 of them. There's one. They're a bit random. There's one where she goes off to Russia. There's one where she goes on tour in America. And I don't think I read the other 2. And the first one is by far and away, I think, the best and the classic. I know there's one that covers the war years. But yeah, anyway, I was surprised to discover there were others. I hadn't realised. I just knew the one.
This recommendation has turned into a discussion.
What we've been reading. It clearly would make an excellent book club book. I'm going to recommend a book that we have mentioned on the podcast before. It's Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. And Olive is an older lady. This book dips in and out of her story in this small coastal town in Maine where she lived. Sometimes she's the main subject and sometimes she just features in other people's narratives. But it's another interesting one in that I felt very much when I was reading it that it's very much from an older person's perspective. It's someone at the end of their life who's reflecting. In a way, she doesn't allow herself to think back too much, and that's because some very sad things have happened in her life and she hasn't really ever managed to come to terms with them. And in some ways, it's very bleak and dark. Not only things that happen to her, but things that happen to other characters who come in and out of the novel. It almost reads more like a collection of short stories, but they are linked. They're quite firmly linked, and so I don't usually get on that well with short stories, but this was fine for me. It felt like enough of an arc to everything that I was quite happy with it. But it does have a certain redemptive quality at the end, that stops it from being totally bleak. And I do think there's a lot in there for discussion, and the writing is good and interesting and it draws you in. And yet again, I think it's not a book without flaws, and I think it's one of those ones that might make for a very interesting book club debate. So yes, Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. And before they left, I got recommendations out of Andy and Sally and Natalie at my book club.
The book I recommend, or thought most of while I was reading, was firstly Evil in War, because he writes about the aristocracy. He's funny, sort of very sharp writing, some ridiculous characters, but very good characters, which I liked in this book. The closest to this book is probably A Handful of Dust. So it's about a relationship. It's a woman who, in this book, is bored with sort of living with her husband at home. So she actually leaves her husband, meets a pretty useless lover in London, and moves to London to have some fun. It all goes horribly wrong. It's all quite grim, but the characters are very funny, and he's very funny. I'd recommend anything else from Evil in War as well, probably above this, but this is closer to the book.
I think the obvious recommendation following on from All Passion Spent is Virginia Woolf, and particularly Orlando, because Orlando was written as a sort of almost a gift to Vita Sackville-West, and the character of Orlando is based on aspects of Vita Sackville-West at the time that she and Virginia were having an affair. And again, it's about the role of women and women's choices, and the way that Orlando, because he changes sex, starts off as a man then becomes a woman, and the different choices that he has at different points in history due to that. It's very short, but it's a really engaging read, and I think there would be a lot to discuss.
I would recommend The Longest Journey by E.M. Forster, because it's also a novel about denying one's own identity, particularly within the context of a marriage and the unhappiness that that can lead to, but also reflecting on that relationship and what it means to both parties. It's possibly a little bit deeper than All Passion Spent and a bit more depressing, but it's also a wonderful novel set in the start of the 20th century. It's quite interesting, the role of women within that book. While obviously Vita Sackville-West has a more feminist stance, E.M. Forster is looking at things from quite a male perspective, and actually the women in the novel tend to suffer, which I think is a shame, but it's a traditional picture of a marriage among perhaps that sort of intelligentsia of that time, and how the idea that getting married to a woman means that you would have to give up your ideals of philosophy and writing and actually sort of settle into a profession that you can support your family, and how one's sort of own will suffers because of that.
So this is actually about a man having to make compromises and give up something.
Yes, yeah, it's exactly. It's different from All Passion Spent in that way, but equally about identity being lost within a relationship.
Sounds fascinating. Thank you.
And our bookseller recommendation this episode comes from Emily Rhodes of Daunt Books in Hampstead, also the leader of the Walking Book Club. She returns to the podcast with a few more suggestions for books you might like to try.
I suppose anyone reading All Passion Spent would be interested to read A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. Vita Sackville-West and Virginia Woolf and All Passion Spent was in part written as a fictional counterpart to Woolf's polemic, A Room of One's Own. The whole idea of All Passion Spent to me is about, it's never too late to get your room of your own. It's even when you're Lady Slane's old age of, I think she's 88, it's a sort of tougher read, but it's got some great ideas in, and it's such a seminal work. Every feminist should read it. The other book that feels to me very similar in style and ideas, and again, that thing of finding your own space as a woman, specifically actually an older woman, is Lolly Willows. It's about a spinster. She doesn't marry. She gets kind of parcelled about a bit, and then she finds her own house in the countryside. But actually, brilliantly, she makes a pact with the devil and becomes a witch, which sounds completely mad, but actually in the book it is brilliant. And again, I think the phrase used in Lolly Willows is a life of one's own, and it's very much got that same polemical feel to it, and you feel the same issues are driving it. It's just a slightly kind of wackier take. A really brilliant book, should be so much better known, really strange, beautifully written as well. I think it's a good one.
And then what else is in this enticing stack you've pulled out?
So yeah, I'm going to edit the stack down, but different in that it's about a young woman rather than an old woman, is this book called Ruby Fruit Jungle, which is published by Vintage Classics, and that's by Rita Mae Brown. Again, is that thing about finding your own path, of not being bullied into following a particular path, but having the courage to fight your own battles, do your own thing, find your own voice. It sounds like a cliche like that, but I do love books that are about that. It's also written as really punchy, fresh voice. It just kind of grabs you. I mean, in some ways it's mad. You know, Vita Sackville-West and Rita Mae Brown, their voices are so different, the setting's so different, but I think they both still have that same cause driving them of a woman finding her place and determining that place on her own. I absolutely love All Passion Spent. In fact, I named my daughter Vita in part thanks to the book. It's saying it's never too late. Yeah. You know, you can have what seems like your whole life living the wrong life in a way, although there are bits about it that you enjoy and love and are happy with, but you look at this path that you didn't take and then actually you can still take it. And I suppose there's also that kind of love story with Mr. Fitzgeorge, who you saw all those years ago and then comes back. It's a really lovely story, and this image of them wandering across the heath together in their frail, tottering steps, following where Keats used to walk. I found it very, very touching.
Yeah, I hope more people discover it as a result of listening to the show. I certainly was very, very pleased to have read it. Thank you, Emily, so much.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
Books mentioned in this episode were Diary of a Provincial Lady by E.M. Delafield, Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout, A Handful of Dust by Evelyn Waugh, Orlando by Virginia Woolf, and The Longest Journey by E.M. Forster. Emily recommended A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, Lolly Willows by Dorothy Whipple, and Ruby Fruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown. If you're interested to find out more about Emily's Walking Book Club, you can find all the details at her website emilybooks.wordpress.com/The Walking Book Club, or simply Emily Walking Book Club into Google will bring up her site and the link via Daunt Books. And if you're in the mood, do listen back to episode 5 of our show, where we discuss The Trouble with Goats and Sheep by Joanna Cannon and featured a full-length interview with Emily on a windy Hampstead Heath.
On our next episode, we'll be discussing Two Serious Ladies by Jane Bowles, a modernist classic published in 1943.
For now, thanks for listening and happy reading.
Da-da-da-da. That's not our theme tune. What have you been reading, Kate?
I've been reading The God of Small Things, which I didn't really quite mean to read, but I had it on my Kindle and I idly opened it up one day and was just immediately captivated and so drawn in, and I've been so enjoying it. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I'm most of the way through. And
have you read it before?
I read it when it came out.
Okay, so you were kind of inspired by the Ministry of Utmost Happiness.
I forget things I read 5 years ago, so there's not much chance of me remembering it. But I remember it being very atmospheric, and I remember the thing about the capital letters, and both those things are still true. It's just so much more coherent than the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, and I think that's its strength. But it has that same magic. It tells quite a small story. It tells a story of someone who falls in love with someone who's an untouchable and a member of this caste where, you know, it's a sort of forbidden relationship. And this just leads to catastrophic consequences for almost everybody who is connected with the people in question, and particularly the children of the relationship who sort of tell the story. But she's so wonderful the way she writes about that relationship between those children and their mother, and it's just very intense, but it's beautifully done, and I've really been enjoying it, and very interesting to read it having read the latest book and then going back and actually being more impressed by that debut novel, and yet appreciating, I think, perhaps the journey that you sense she's come on to the point where she was able to write The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. I mean, it has that same interest in these huge problems that they face in India, you know, the caste system, this ancient system, this absurd system of, you know, dictating people's position in society according to by birth, and also the position of women and you know, like with Lady Slane, but their lack of power, their lack of agency, And that's not explicit in this novel in the way that perhaps Ministry is much more polemical. But nonetheless, it's implicit in every word, in every line, and you feel kind of outraged. And
maybe that was part of the problem with Ministry about Most Happiness, just harking back to the last episode. It was kind of hitting you over the head with its interest in themes and problems.
Yes, I think so. I think that's perhaps fair. So yeah, I would recommend actually to anyone like me who is curious to revisit The God of Small Things. It's been a real pleasure. What have you been reading? It hasn't been that long since our last recording. Have you had time to read anything else?
I haven't been reading a ton of things, but actually what I have been reading kind of stitches together really nicely. So my nephew was visiting me, and when we were on holiday in the summer, we were reading Enid Blyton together, which he has never read, and which I know we're not really supposed to like anymore, but Enid Blyton and, the famous...
Which ones?
Well, that's what I was trying to remember.
Was it about a magic tree? Was it about 5 children? Was it about 7 children? Was it about a doll? Did it involve pixies?
It's the 5 and the 7.
Was there a school?
But I think there was another one. There's the famous 5, and there's the magic 7.
Secret 7.
The secret 7, sorry. And then there's the one with Timothy the dog and George.
No, that's
Georgian.
the famous 5.
Is that the famous 5? That's what I was trying to look
Did you
at.
not read these books?
Yes, I was very young. That's my point.
It's so funny. I can't remember The God of Small Things, a book I read 20 years ago, but I can remember the characters in the famous 5 books.
Well, this is it. I can remember the characters. I just couldn't remember which band of children they slotted into.
And I think also you were perhaps defined quite early on by whichever you picked up first. So I was a famous 5 reader, and I never really got into the Secret 7. There's too many characters.
I loved the famous 5, and I've been reading that too. So when my nephew visited, I was reading that to him again.
That must be nice.
And she is good. Like, you just really want to know about the gold,
Right.
and how are they going to find the gold?
Yeah, the suspense.
And I started reading this to my nephew in the summertime when we were on holiday, and then he took the book with him, and he hadn't kept on reading, and so he brought it down for me to keep reading, and I was like, oh, what? How could you not have found out by this point what's happened to the gold, the ingots?
So what was the sense that perhaps he was slightly less concerned?
I don't know.
I find with children, how old is he?
11.
Because mine are younger, mine are 5 and 6, but they do have this lovely thing where actually they'll very happily just stop something, and they're quite happy to just either leave it entirely or, go back to it and pick up where you left off. But they don't have that sort of sense of, wanting to complete things that adults have, and also that need to know where something is going. They're very happy. I think it's perhaps come back to that thing about they're very much always in the present moment, which is something that's just really so lovely about being around them, because they sort of force you to do the same thing. But so anything that they're doing, whether it's watching a film or being read a story or whatever, they're very happy just to stop.
Well, I think that was it though, is that, when Finley and I are together, he expects that we will read that book. And then when we're apart, why would he keep reading that book? It's what he does with his aunt.
Yeah, it's very nice. It's very
So
sweet.
that was
That's a lovely thing to do.
Yeah, it was really, really sweet.
And so you haven't really been doing any serious grown-up reading though?
No. Just my book club reading.
And that's fine.
Oh, and Georgette Heyer. But, I've had a break.
Have you managed to stop downloading Georgette Heyer's on your phone?
Yeah. Almost. I did read a few more.
And was there a sort of resounding thwart because you dropped The Marriage Plot by Jeffrey Genovese on the floor and didn't pick it up again?
I didn't like it. I didn't like the characters.
That's okay.
I didn't
okay
like the
not
writing.
to like everything that I like.
I know. Well, most people didn't like
And
that. I'm just
frequently you
saying. You're an outlier on that one.
Yeah. No, I am not an outlier.
You are. You should look at our Instagram feed. Other people are in agreement with me.
Really?
Yeah.
God, I need to round up some. I need to round up some other people who like that book. And maybe I need to reread it myself. Now I'm in a kind of rereading phase. There's a nice thing I used to do a lot when I was younger, where I would read a book that I loved, but then there would be a nice sense where I'd read a whole load of other things and I'd forget it, and then I'd go back to it and have all the pleasure of having forgotten it and reading it again. And it's a shame you really lose that as an adult. Now it's always about the next thing. I've got like 3 things, delightfully kind of stacked up that I've got from the library. Zadie Smith's Swing Time. I got the Kyo McClear Bird's Art Life Death that Joe from the book I recommended that I really want to read. So I've got these nice things waiting for me. I don't have time to reread things. That's why it's so odd going back to The God of Small Things. And yet, actually, there can be such pleasure in going back to things sometimes. So maybe that's a nice thing to do in the winter. I recommend it.